Hi, everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I thank you all for attending. I always consider it a great compliment that people take time out from their day to listen to what I have to say. I've done a lot of webinars for FX Street. I've done quite a few on the Greek situation. When I was choosing the topic for this last week, I really was not disposed to do another event, another webinar on Greece and Europe. Having done quite a few in the past. However, with the deadline tomorrow for the IMF payment and with the resulting developments over the weekend, it certainly seemed that it was an appropriate choice. Or as I said to Adinda at the time when I chose the topic, this one is ordained. I don't really have any choice about what I have to talk about on Monday with Tuesday and the IMF the next day. So here we are. It has been a fascinating run for the past couple of years. I have maintained from the very beginning that Greece has far more power in this negotiation, this confrontation with Europe than they have let on, or at least than most commentators have voiced. And I think the reason for that is that Greece has the ability to put the future of the euro into to make it change completely. The sort of confident concept of the Europeans who are in favor of this, that yes, that's just a side note, actually. I'll be glad to answer any questions, either on the Q&A panel or on the chat. Just type them in, and I'll deal with them as quickly as I can. I much prefer to have people ask questions than to simply listen to me talk for 45 minutes, which I can do, but I think it's much more interesting when we all participate. So let me just give a little bit more of the background here, and which I'm sure you're all aware of, but I just want to go through it so we're all starting from the same place. And then we can go on to questions, and we can take this any place you want because it's an interesting situation that covers politics, history, finance, almost any topic you would like can be found in what's going on in Greece and Europe these days, and certainly over the next couple of weeks, and has been for the past couple of years, although it's not always been obvious. The immediate situation. The Greeks, to the horror. By the way, I'll put in a plug for something here in New York where I live. The show called Alexander Hamilton, is a hip-hop retelling of the life of Alexander Hamilton. I saw it about a month and a half ago. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's coming to Broadway. It's been down at the Public Theater. So if anyone, and yes, that did happen. He did definitely get it right. And if anyone is in town over the next couple of months, I recommend seeing it. Anyway, I'm not here to give plugs to shows, but it really is great. Okay, so the immediate situation. The Greeks have instituted capital controls. You can't take out too much money. The reason? Very simple. If they let everybody in Greece take out as much money they wanted, the banks would fail immediately. They'd run out of money. When banks run out of money, they fail. They don't get reconstituted. They're out. And that institutes panic. So they're not going to do that. It kind of does amaze me that over the past couple of weeks in the run-up to this, that Greeks still have money in Greek banks. I mean, I certainly would not. I would have transferred my money out someplace a long time ago. Be that as it may. All right, let me answer that question with that. I mean, since I spoke about Alexander Hamilton. During the Revolutionary War, all of the American states each operated as individual entities as far as finance goes. The Continental Congress did not have any real taxing powers, any real financial powers. It was basically a debating society. They would promise money, they would issue script, but nobody, it wasn't worth anything particularly. They issued paper money. It wasn't anybody can issue paper money. You and I can issue paper money, but nobody's going to view it. Well, the government would get upset, but technically we could, but nobody would use it. Nobody would value it. It wouldn't work as a method of payment, transfer, and all the things that money does. So the Continental Congress issued money, but then the states also issued debts. But some states issued far more debt and paid for a great deal more of the expenses than others. And so Alexander Hamilton's idea was that the federal government, this is after the Constitution, not the Articles of Confederation, took over all of the debt from the states prior to, I don't know if they did prior to the Constitution, adopting the Constitution, or prior, or just a Revolutionary War debts. And so they could solve, all those debts became federal government debt. All the states started out clean. That's what he meant. And the reason that was the case, because it put, then the U.S. could issue bonds to, before it could get its taxes in shape. I mean, in those days there were no income taxes. And so that put the U.S. federal government on a regulated basis, because if various of the states were arguing about who owed what, who paid for more, then you would not have any kind of functioning government, certainly as far as trade and external trade relations go. So by doing that and assuming all the debt, the federal government became the entity for funding the national debt. And that's why he did it that way. To have not done, and the problem was, well, the issue was that states that hadn't issued a lot of debt didn't want to be responsible for states that did through the federal government. But if it had not happened, then you would have the states themselves arguing against each other as to who owed what and who paid for what. And to eliminate that sort of dissension underneath the Constitution, underneath the federal government, that is why Alexander Hamilton wanted that done, and he did it. And he convinced them to do it, and it worked as far as putting the United States on a regularized financial basis. Okay, so let me give a little more here, and then we will talk. I mean, the more questions you have, the better. I'll try to answer them. I am not by any means a financial expert. I am a former foreign currency trader. However, I do have some degrees in these types of things. Okay, so immediately, the immediate issues that precipitated this. In January, the Greeks who have had 5 years of, I mean, the immediate precipitation of this politically is horror of horrors, democracy. The Greeks voted in a government that promised, whether or not it can deliver or not is another question, but promised to end the austerity that's been going on for 5 years. Greek unemployment is said to be 25%. It's probably considerably higher. The Greek economy has contracted 25%, an astonishing amount for anyone who lives in a modern country, and Greece is a modern country, having been there quite a few times, although not in the past couple of years. The problem for Greece, and I'll just go over this very quickly so that everyone kind of understands exactly what's going on. You know, you hear stories about austerity and this and that, but what's happening? Traditionally, historically, and this is true of Italy and a number of other countries, and Spain and Portugal, when they have their own currencies, what often happened, the Italians used to do this regularly, to maintain export efficiency, competitiveness, they'd periodically devalue their currency. That kept their exports and their tourism industry going. It may have been a bit chaotic. It may have seemed to some other countries that didn't do that a childish way of doing things. Nevertheless, it functioned within the constraints of the political and the cultural systems of these various countries. They can no longer do that. They all have the euro. They no longer control their currency. So if Greece, as an example, is not as efficient in competing against other countries for its exports. It can do two things historically. It can make those exports cheaper by devaluing the drachma, or the Italian lira, or the Spanish peseta, or the Portuguese escudo, or the German mark, which was occasionally not officially devalued, as I recall, but certainly went down in value. That's one way to do it. That can't happen now. So what happens? It is with this lovely and disguising and pretty much untruthful term called internal devaluation. Well, what does internal devaluation mean? If you can't make your exports cheaper by making your currency cheaper, you make your exports cheaper by making your exports cheaper, meaning costing less to produce. What is the largest component of any industrial product? It's usually the wages of the workers. So when you hear economists talk about Greece's internal devaluation, what it means is that everybody gets their salaries and pensions cut so that the products produced in Greece, whatever they are, cost less. Why do they cost less? Because you pay the workers less. It's not the only thing that's going on, but it's the biggest part of it. So this has now been going on for 5 years in Greece. You say the Greeks are not terribly happy about it. Now, it is not irrelevant, but it is financially irrelevant how this situation evolved. And what do I mean by that? Greece, by the standards of the Maastricht Treaty, should not have been allowed to join the euro. The fact that the Greek government connived with apparently Goldman to hide some of their currency positions in some sort of time swap, I don't know exactly how they did it, so that their books appeared to meet the criteria to join the euro. As I've said many, many times, I find that nonsensical that the Europeans themselves and the ECB and everybody else did not know this was going on. So Greece probably should not have been allowed to join the euro. Step one. It was allowed to join for political reasons because the euro is primarily a political project. It's been sold as a financial product, as a unification project, but behind all of that is politics and the desire to drive Brussels to dominance in Europe for reasons which are based in the horrible history, and I've said this many times, of Europe in the Second World War. Fine, that is true. The problem they're let me. There's so much here that it's going to be hard to put to, but I do find it a fascinating topic. It, matter of fact, has everything in it that I find fascinating about finance and currencies. So the Greeks should not have been allowed to join. They're allowed to join for political reasons. The ever expanding union. Okay, great, but everybody knew it. Two. Yes, the Greeks borrowed a whole lot of money, and they didn't put it to particularly good use. That's true. But who lent them the money? The idea that the German bankers or whoever lent them the money were all hoodwinked by the devious Greeks is nonsense. Everybody knew what was going on here. Apparently, everybody just didn't think about it very much. How could this be? That the Greeks can borrow money as if they were Germans. They're not. Their economy is not as efficient. It's not even remotely as efficient. It's much smaller. All of the things that a prudent loan officer. But why did this happen? My guess is that Greece now received, once it joined the euro, the official imprimatur of the European Union. Everything's hunky-dory. The Greeks are like the Germans. We're all Europeans. We're all Italians, whatever. We all love each other, and we're all the same. So we all naturally pay the same interest rates on our loans. These are self-deceptions of the European Union, of the Greeks, of everyone involved in this particular situation. So it's my feeling that there are no, as with all good tragedy, everybody's right and everybody's wrong. And that's what's going on here. The Greek point of view, that they are essentially debt slaves to Europe. This is true. They will never be able to pay off this. Their economy will never recover under this type of debt load. Certainly it's been going on for 5 years and has recovered. The money that comes from the IMF goes right back to the IMF. The money that comes from the Europeans goes right back to European banks. It doesn't stay in Greece. All they're doing is paying off their own loans with their own money so that they don't have to tell their people that these loans are bankrupt. The loans aren't coming back. So the Greeks are right that this will not do the Greeks any good. The Germans are right that they borrowed the money. And everybody's wrong that they all deluded each other and themselves that this was a good idea. The basic problem for the euro, from a democratic point of view, which is why European bureaucrats, I hate to say elites, but I will, the political class in Europe, is so very reluctant to have anything to do with the euro and Brussels and the EU executive put to referendum, put to the consultation of their democracies, of their democratic people. Because the problem for the euro is that it has not delivered prosperity for many, many people in Europe. The EU has, by and large, but the euro, it's been much, much more uneven as to who actually prospers. Okay, let me stop for a second and take a look at some of these questions here, because we have quite a discussion going on here. I'm glad that everybody's enjoying this, or at least paying attention. Please take care. Yes, now, right now, there's lots of things going on in Greece as far as this. I've been there, as I said, I've been there quite a few times. Greece is, the idea that the Greeks don't work is not true. All right? The Greece has a larger off-the-books economy as far as percentage goes than almost anyone else in Europe. I ran these numbers from 2012, and I'm sure it's greater now. Nonetheless, the realities in Greece, and I agree you have to be very careful of what you read and what you believe as far as the way the Greek situation is portrayed. Most commentators on the markets, as you already know, I try to keep myself out of that particular group, are simply commentators on their institution and their own institution's books. I don't mean that in any cynical fashion, although sometimes it's true. What I mean is that the people speak from a particular point of view, which is very much identified with what they do and how they view the world financial system and their own institution's participation in it. So that's one thing to remember. That this has not brought real hardship in Greece, I do not believe. I believe it very much has. And I don't think that this is a situation where any particular side has an overriding moral ascendancy. Okay, so let me look at these. The problem with rescheduling debt is even that doesn't work. I have a, it has no reality to it. I have a, I don't have it up on the, I have mostly market stuff up here, but I don't have it up on the computer. But let me tell you some of the debts. Greece has euro billions due. And remember, they borrowed, I think, $340 billion. That's only recently. 180% of GDP. There is no way to reschedule that debt out into the future where it doesn't create an enormous and probably insufferable burden on the Greek economy. Other nations have defaulted on their debt. It's not uncommon. Argentina's done it a couple of times. Russia did it recently. It's not uncommon. It's the issue for the European Union that is the biggest preventer of this happening. And what happens when nations do that? Everybody gets annoyed. The lenders lose their money, a good portion of it. Some of them sue. And what happens? Within a couple of years, those nations are generally back in the credit markets. There's no doubt that that would happen to Greece also. But there are two big things standing in the way. One is the Europeans don't want to reschedule the debt because they'll have, as I said earlier, they'll have to admit to their politicians, to their electorate, that the whole idea of the union, one, is not nearly as secure as they thought it was. Because after all, nobody voted really for the European Union. And nobody voted for the euro. These are ostensible democracies. Nobody voted for these things. Nobody. The few that did vote actually rejected them. The Brits opted out. The Danes, I believe, don't use the euro, although it's tied. The Norwegians don't. So there are ways around this. Okay, let's go a little further here. Let me just see what this is. So the problem is twofold. One, if they reschedule the debt, then Germany has to go to its taxpayers and say, whoops, we paid for the Greek pensions. Two, a bigger problem, and I think the biggest problem as far as, because everybody in Europe knows this, these debts are going to have to be forgiven at some point. Either the Greeks are going to vote themselves out of the euro, and then the debts will just be defaulted. Or at some point, they're going to have to forgive the debts officially because there's no other way they're going to pay these things. What's the problem immediately? The problem is everybody's looking. The Spaniards have an election coming up. I believe it's in the fall, or is it the fall of 2016? The leading party is a new party which wants out of the euro. Portugal has huge debt problems. Their debt is structured differently. It's not, if I remember, it's not overwhelmingly public. It's very heavily public, private, and corporate. Nonetheless, it's still debt that's got to be repaid. So these nations, Italy, hasn't really grown in about a decade economically. These nations are watching this confrontation, shall we say, a neutral word. And if Greek gets to reschedule its debt, Greek gets forgiven on some of its debt, why should not they? The populist movement, Alexis Tsipras is an elected leader. There are politicians in all of these nations, including France, although not so much Germany, waiting to ride this populist wave to power. And if they can portray themselves as the deliverer, anti-austerity, they could very well win. And this is, I think, the real reason that the Europeans, the Eurocrats, if you will, are being so obstinate about not permitting rescheduling. Okay. Let me take some look here. Britain also certainly has its referendum coming. I believe Cameron has said he will hold one. Whether they want to renegotiate their terms, not in the EMU, of course, but of the EU. Because what is going on in the EU is they're continually issuing more and more regulations, controlling more and more areas. They are essentially attempting to devolve national sovereignty from the capitals to Europe. And the problem is it's not very democratic or very responsive to the national democracies. And that's the biggest issue they have for them. And we'll see how Britain plays that out, but certainly they're watching that. Okay, let me read this. Yes, that's absolutely what you say is absolutely true about Germany. As I said earlier, the idea that these countries did not know, Germany in particular, that the Greeks were fudging their books is nonsense. I just don't believe it. It's impossible to believe that. Therefore, this was coming from the very beginning. It was a situation of mutual, willful self-delusion. This is, after all, the first crisis that the euro's ever faced. The first. I mean, I was sitting there on the trading desk at Bank of Bermuda when the euro started trading on January 3rd, 1999, as a commercial entity before it was available retail. That's it. It's within my career, a good deal less than my whole career, that this has happened. So this is, the idea that this is some fait accompli is nonsense. Okay, yes, absolutely the Greeks have responsibility as well. I mean, it's the definition of tragedy where the inherent qualities, good and bad, of the participants lead to the tragic result, the tragic denouement, the denouement in English, the French word. And that's what you have here. The way that this was constructed and approached, even if done for very good reasons, at the base of all of this situation, both political and economic and financial, is the desire to avoid another 20th century for Europe and for the world, but for Europe especially. Now, that is an admirable goal. Who would want another 20th century? And I'm not making any political judgments here, but it's absolutely true. Its effect on the European populations, 2 world wars, various governments which abuse their population, shall we say, horrific. So it's an admirable goal. Utopia always is. Anyway, let us continue here. Okay, so the other thing we must not forget, and this is from the German point of view particularly, when the Germans become, if you will, a little self-righteous about this, that, who was it, Warren Harding, who said of the Europeans who borrowed money after in the First World War, and people were saying, well, they shouldn't pay them back because they're all broke. And he replied, I believe it was Harding, he said, well, they hired the money, didn't they? Well, that's essentially the point of view that the Germans are trying to take. They borrow the money, pay it back. The same arrangement, the euro, which permitted the Greeks to borrow money at interest rates far lower and in far greater amounts than they should have been allowed to. After all, if the Greek government was borrowing money on the open market without the euro, they wouldn't be in this problem because nobody would have lent it to them, either in the amount or at the rates that they could do under the euro. The other side of that is that the euro, and we must never forget this, the euro has permitted, who has the euro primarily benefited? Not only, but biggest beneficiary in the European Union. Why? Of course, it's the Germans. Because, and this is what I mean by both sides have legitimate points of view, and their points of view are grounded in their own situation, their own national character, if you will, their own political and economic situation. Historical as well. The euro, because of the membership of everybody else in the euro, has not been the dominant, as strong as it would have been were it actually just a German mark. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that throughout the period of the euro, German exports are considerably cheaper than they would have been if they were using their own currency. So the German economy has benefited tremendously from the euro. And we shouldn't forget that either. It is not simply a matter. Remember, at the base of this is a political question. If the arrangements of your government do not benefit the people, sooner or later, a politician will arise to take advantage of that to seek power. And to seek power both in a good sense, meaning representing the wishes of the people. And that is one of the things that has happened here. Yes, here we go. Let's deal with some of the technical questions here, and then we're going to move on to some of the other things here. I'm just looking at this, what we have here. That's right. Without the ELA, the Greek banks fold. Without the ELA, Greeks can't pay anything, because if the banks don't have any money to issue, and Greek workers for the government have to be paid, then where does the money come from? The banks don't have any. They've run out of money. Now, I guess they could print euros. I don't actually know the answer to that. What would happen if the Greeks actually started printing their own euros? I would imagine that they could do it. Technically, they could just print the euros. Although I don't know if the Greek actually has a currency printing business in the country, because I've read that they have contracted other places with drachma printing if they need to, I think here in the United States. But what would happen, of course, would be any euro issued after a certain date, say by the Greek Central Bank, would not be accepted as payment by other European banks and other European systems. So it wouldn't actually work. And it would end up being a Greek euro within Greece, and that would be no different than simply issuing a drachma. It's a currency that would be utilized only within the country, and you couldn't use it externally until it had some sort of basis and a value, certainly set by the currency markets. I remember trading the Greek drachma, but that's another story. So if the Greek banks don't have any money because they have actually run out of cash, whether it's electronic or notes is irrelevant, then at the next payday, Greek workers of the government and everybody else can't get paid. There's nothing to pay them with. So at that point, the Greek government would have to issue an IOU. But what is an IOU except script? It's the same thing. It doesn't matter what it is. Something that would function in some fashion as a currency within Greece. Of course, as soon as they do that, you can call it what you want, it will immediately require evaluation externally, both for the euro and other dollars and other currencies. And that's where the currency markets will come in. We'll all start trading it immediately, of course, and the value will plummet. I heard a statistic on the day today that wherever a new currency is issued at, it will probably immediately devalue by half. That's probably accurate, although how accurate, nobody has any idea. Now, let's go back to the politics of this, because if you look at the markets here, and let me put up so we have some charts up here, but let me put them up. The euro here. Now, let me tell you where the euro actually is right now. The euro went down to like 109.45. Actually, it went down to 109.54. Okay, it is now trading at 111.70. It is all the way back to where it started from, before the opening in Auckland and Sydney on Sunday night, Monday morning, New York time. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other markets right now, and I'll get you see if I can find a fascinating topic actually is the Chinese market, but we're not going to do with that. Okay, so let's take a look at now. Let's see where it is. Hang on. Okay, the Dow is now down 198 points. Okay, that's an interesting question, but it's not the particular time. The euro's all the way back. Let's see what the DAX is doing. Let me pull up the DAX here, and we'll tell you where the DAX is. So the point I'm going to make with this is, okay, so the DAX is now back to about another 30 points higher than this. So it's still down a good 100 points. What does this mean? What we're seeing here is that after the initial shock, what is happening with the markets is that they are assuming the Greek polls. There's been polling on this for weeks, for years actually, in Greece about what. I'll take a look at those comments in a minute. No, I'll tell you what I think is happening here, and this is the question we're talking about here. The assumptions that are going to go through the market. What have we been assuming for the past year? That they will find an answer to the question. After all the hedging and all the fudging and everything else, the Europeans will come up with some sort of solution. What have we seen so far? That hasn't happened. Surprises everybody, I think. That has to do with that's the cause of this collapse today in the euro from more than two figures. What's the recovery about? The recovery is that, well, one, fantasies are hard to disappear, but two, the polling in Greece, and they're essentially asked, that's right, Germany needs it. They're essentially asking Greece, the Greeks, whether they want to stay in the euro. The technical question, I think, the actual question they're coming up with is, do we accept the terms issued by the Europeans? As far as pension cuts and new taxes and stuff like that. I've seen Tsipras called a opportunistic politician because when Papandreou wanted to do the same kind of referendum 4 or 5 years ago, he was against it. I don't agree with that. I think in this case that since however much dislocation, economic, financial, personal, Greece has undergone to this point, it will get both worse and prolonged if Greece does leave the euro and has to recreate the drachma. It'll be very unpleasant for many, many people for several years. And I can understand, in fact, agree with Mr. Tsipras's willingness, desire to put this in a democracy to a referendum. And so the point I think that we're seeing on some of these charts is that the markets, after their initial shock, are assuming that the Greeks will not vote to leave the euro. Is this true? I think it probably is. But if this is not true, now one of the things you're going to see over the next couple of days, and they're only doing this for a week, it's next Sunday, are going to be as many polls as possible. And I don't know how efficient Greek polling is or anything like that, but you're going to see other polls. And if there's any movement, remember the great turmoil when it seemed when the Scots were taking their vote on whether to leave the United Kingdom, and the great turmoil that created when a poll came out that seemed to indicate that the Scottish National Party had momentum and was headed towards perhaps even a victory to vote to leave the United Kingdom. Huge turmoil in the financial markets. Didn't turn out to be the case. I think we're going to have some of the same issues here. And that's what you're seeing in the markets. That upon consideration, it's likely that the Greeks do not vote to leave the euro. So behind everything else will be an acceptance of the prolonged situation in Greece. Because after all, even if things are terrible in Greece right now, and as I said, I haven't been there in a number of years, they will get worse only by degree under the proposals of the Europeans as currently given to the Greeks. Pensions will be cut a bit more, taxes will go up a bit more. It is not at least a leap into the unknown, both for the Greeks, the Greek government, the Europeans, and basically the world economy. The Exit from the euro. Now, this is how it's going to be portrayed as well. I have read, although I don't know if it's true, that the Tsipras government will advocate for a no vote, perhaps thinking that this will give them more leverage. I don't think that's the case. If they vote no, it does not appear at this moment that the Europeans are going to accept that as a simple negotiating position and change their view so far. Okay, let me look at some of these questions here. There is no question that that comment is correct, that the European solutions to the problem so far have only addressed the symptoms. They have simply not addressed the underlying problems of the competitiveness of the Greek economy and the effect of the euro on the less efficient economies of Europe. And that's basically all of them, except for Germany, maybe some of the other Northern European countries, Finland perhaps. And this is true, because there is no way to address that. The only way to address that is by becoming poorer. And when you have been promised incessantly that the euro is a benefit, it's inevitable, and then you find out, as many people have found out, that the euro does not work to your benefit, and that your politicians and your governments, which have sponsored and basically forced the euro on their people, have to answer for it. So it is true that the European approach to this problem has been a strictly programmatic approach. You borrow the money, pay it back. That doesn't work. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Yes, I saw that. Whether or not, I don't know that I agree with Mr. El-Arian on this. In order for that to be true, the Greeks will have to vote to leave the euro. They will have to reject the European terms, and I don't think that that is going to function as a bargaining chip. I think it has gone too far for that. Now, that said, some of the actual technical, one thing I think you can expect, if the Europeans are smart, and I don't guarantee that this is true, but we'll find out, over this week, if European political leaders view this, I think, correctly, they should be as mollifying as possible. You should hear Angela Merkel say, we don't want the Greeks to leave. It costs them, what was it, the phrase of I think it's Samuel Johnson? If you know a man is going to be hanged, it costs you nothing to be polite. Same idea here. It won't require much, I think, to sway the Greeks to stay within the euro. And one thing that would be very helpful are lots of accommodating words, even if they don't change the terms from other European leaders. And I think you're going to see that over the next week. So and the other thing is, there are actual dates here where things, anything in a financial term that's written down is only written down and enforceable because it's regulatory. And if the people who wrote the regulations decide they want to change it, then they change it. So this idea that there's some deadline after which Greece falls off a cliff and it's immutable and nobody can do anything about it is not true. Tomorrow, the Greeks owe €1.5 billion to the IMF. They're not going to pay it. Are they suddenly going to be expelled from the euro on a rocket? No, of course not. The ECB has said the immediate thing that could expel the Greeks would be, of course, if the ECB withdraws the ELA funds that it's given the banks. They're not going to do that. There's no reason for them to do that. So is there a hard and fast deadline? No, there aren't any, except for the ECBs. Now, there is a payment to the ECB on bonds, I believe, on July 20th. If there is such a thing as a hard and fast deadline, that's it, because it's going to be very difficult for the ECB within its rules, especially after another couple of weeks, to construe that as anything but meaning that the collateral already extended by the Greek banks back to the ECB to back up the ELA money is now worthless, and therefore they can't lend them any more money. In fact, should take back the money they've got. So that probably is a hard deadline. But we have between those, we have the referendum on Sunday. What a week. The betting, as I've said, has to be on this particular topic, that even though Greece has probably suffered more under the euro the past 5 years, and probably in general as well, than any other European country, people, nation, culture, whatever you want to say, I don't think, unless something changes in the next week, and I can't imagine what would, that the Greeks will vote to leave the euro, because that's essentially what it's going to be. You can word it any way you want. You're going to get an enormous outpouring, as someone noted on our chat, from institutions within Europe, from essentially, the Atlantic coast to the border of Russia, promoting Greek membership within the euro, within the EU. It would be incredibly foolish for the Europeans not to sometime this week offer, even if they're not large, some type of concessions. They need to win this election, the Europeans, the believers in the euro and in the ever-growing European Union. They need to win this election. It is, I think, something which in the biggest picture has been a long time coming, meaning not specifically the Greek crisis, but the idea that the European Union and the European bureaucracy emanating and residing in Brussels has never really been called to any democratic account. And that's essentially what this is now. You can make all sorts of historical allusions to Athenian democracy and all these other things, do whatever you want with it. But in fact, most of the aggrandizement of power and regulation by Brussels over the past 15 years, particularly since the beginning, the advent of the euro, has never been put up for any sort of democratic approval anywhere. It's not entirely true, but it's close to being true. And what you have now, forced by this crisis, which has been going on for 5 years, by the way, it's some crisis, and by Mr. Tsipras. Who else should make, in a democracy, we're talking the largest picture here, who else should make this decision for the Greeks? I fail to see how there is any negative from permitting the Greek people to decide this. I will bet you get some serious participation levels from this vote. And for the Europeans, and I can't believe that they're too myopic to see this. Winning a vote like this, the people, who support all of the, the unification and the euro and everything else, will be the greatest support for their project. Okay, let me see if we have a few more comments here. I think I have to quit pretty soon. I know it was only a 45-minute webinar today, and I know there's one after us. You know, yeah, that's probably true. If the Greeks vote to leave, which honestly I don't think they're going to, we'll see how this plays out. But I just don't think I don't think they're going to go that route. In the long run, yes, it probably will be better for the Greeks because they will be forced, in the most rigorous circumstances, to run their economy so that it works, and to find ways to both make money and support the standard of living that they want. They'll actually have to pay for it and not borrow it. That is true. Otherwise, they essentially will be under the control of the Europeans essentially forever. There's really no way around that. I don't know how this will play out. It'll be a fascinating topic to watch. And I don't really have any sense of the opinions and the emotions of the Greek electorate. I'm not Greek after all. My family, a generation and a half back, are from southern Italy, although from an area that was actually settled by the Greeks. And there are Western Greek ruins not very far from the village where my father comes from. Nonetheless, the attitude of the Greeks towards this, I really don't have any great insight into. My only comment is that people tend to be inherently conservative, and they tend to, I don't mean in any political sense, and they generally prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. And as far as the austerity effects for the past 5 years on Greece, that is the devil they know. And voting to leave the European Monetary Union and the Euro is the devil they don't know. So we are going to have a great week. It's going to be very interesting. Let us continue to watch. I think the most sensitive to the markets, what we're seeing here, are the currency markets, which is what we all participate in. If the euro starts to go down hard again, and watch gold as well, I agree with that. Gold, I would say, has more to do with the overall world picture than this particular one. If you're looking for the equities, the Dow has been hard hit today. But my guess is it has more to do with the Chinese situation and the collapse in the Shanghai Exchange, which is now down 20% in a little more than a month. Yes, and flight to safety. So we're going to have a fascinating week. If anyone has any questions, comments, considerations, or jokes, as I usually ask, please type them in or send me. I'll put my email in there. I hope this has been interesting. It's a great topic, and we will do it again shortly. Again, I thank all of you truly for attending. I take it as a great compliment. Thank you very much. Everyone have a great day.